Hello, and thank you for tuning into the European Guanxi podcast. We bring together young scholars, professionals, and experts to strengthen dialogue and understanding about the evolving relationship between the European Union and China. And we have exciting news. European Guanxi just won the European Charlemagne Youth Prize 2026, a European Parliament award that recognizes projects led by young Europeans that foster the understanding and cooperation in Europe. So, to dive deeper into our work, make sure to catch our new episodes every 2 weeks. And today I am joined by Dr. Clara Weinhardt, assistant professor and researcher at Maastricht University, and also deputy coordinator of the Horizon project ENSURED, which focuses on how the EU and its members can transform global governance. So, welcome and thank you for joining me, Clara.
Thanks a lot for the invitation and congrats on the award.
Thank you. In this episode, we will map China's role in the WTO regarding forms of engagement and contestation under the so-called geoeconomic turn that is currently reshaping multilateral trade governance. And we will touch upon potential WTO reforms by China and the EU. So I'm also looking forward to diving into your sphere of research by including also the questions what all of this means for developing economies in the global south. But we will come back to that later. So first, let's dive into China's role in the WTO. And to provide some background information for our listeners, the WTO has governed global trade relations since 1995, but today it faces a broad range of issues that some describe as a deadlock. And that deadlock becomes visible, for example, when countries are not adhering to pre-agreed liberal principles, or the US is blocking appointments for the WTO's dispute settlement, and in general, there is a deepening geopolitical rivalry. And then, of course, we have China in the WTO. So before we can assess China's role, could you maybe give us a brief overview of what the WTO is actually designed to do and what its original liberal doctrine is?
Yes, of course. So the WTO is designed to allow countries to facilitate progressive trade liberalization, and it has three core functions. So first, it serves as a forum for negotiations. So countries that are member can come together and negotiate new trade agreements and decisions on how to liberalize trade. It is also monitoring the implementation of these agreements and all trade-related measures by members, and it serves as a forum for dispute settlement. So this actually makes it stand apart from other international organizations because in its design, it has quite a powerful dispute settlement mechanism. That's dysfunctional since 2019, but in principle, it still serves an important role. And the liberal doctrine is this idea that the WTO is meant to raise living standards by facilitating open and free markets. There have always been some exemptions of what can actually be cushioned from trade liberalization, but I think it's very much modeled on this idea of a free market economy. And this is already where some of the conflicts with China that became a member in 2001 start.
Yeah, you already said it. China exceeded the WTO in 2001. And first, that was seen as more of a great success for liberal economic integration. But how does this evolve over the years? How can we characterize China's role in the WTO ever since?
First, let me reiterate what you already mentioned. It was very much welcomed by the US, Europe, and others that China became a member of the World Trade Organization. And the hope was that China would not only liberalize economically, but also politically, and that becoming a member of the World Trade Organization would steer China in that way. And I think we've seen that China has decided to carve out its own way. It did not become politically liberal. And in terms of its economic model, it's very hybrid. It has liberalized liberal elements, but it also remains highly state-directed, how the economy works, which is in the extent to which we see it in China, in some sectors, still different from the old models of the market liberal economy. And China's role in the World Trade Organization has changed in terms of the expectations that others had, but also more practically. When China joined, it kind of took more of a backseat role, learning how this game of World Trade Organization, negotiations, monitoring, and so on works, and has really built highly skilled WTO lawyers, and then gradually took on more proactive roles to the extent that China now is also shaping negotiations or leading negotiations, for instance, on the investment facilitation for development agreement.
If I can ask a follow-up, why did China firstly decide to join the WTO?
Joining the WTO comes with a lot of economic benefits. Once you join the WTO, you get market access to all members in terms of the tariff rates they had bound in previous rounds of negotiations. So for China, that now is one of the largest exporters, especially in the realm of manufacturing, being a WTO member is very beneficial. And I think at the time there were also forces within China that wanted to use membership in the WTO to buy in reforms domestically to liberalize parts of the economy more that otherwise would have been maybe more difficult to push through.
And what kind of liberal reforms are they? Can you name an example?
I mean, there are many sectors where China had to open its markets, and this has been a very lengthy negotiation process in the accession protocol, including with the US and others, because these negotiations are often then bilateral, where across the board, across all sectors, China had to liberalize its markets. There were transition periods, but you can really see tariff rates in China have gone down because of becoming a member of the WTO.
And if we now zoom more into China's behavior within the structures of the WTO, in one of your research papers, you describe China as a pragmatic rule taker rather than a rule breaker. And I would say this frame as rule breaker we see often in Western discussions. What is exactly the distinctions between pragmatic rule taker and a rule breaker? What does it mean in practice? And why does it matter for how we analyze China's behavior?
I think China has shown to be incredibly pragmatic. That means they are willing to make compromises and to shift positions when need be, for instance, on the developing country status that China still holds. When there was a negotiation of the waiver for COVID-19 related vaccinations for developing country members, China pragmatically agreed to opt out of that without changing its status in the World Trade Organization. But we used in this article, together with Tobias Tenbrink, the rule of pragmatism rather than rule breaker. That's partly also a reflection of the rules that are part of the World Trade Organization's body of law, because a lot of time China operates somewhat in a gray area because the rules were written for market economies. So they were not necessarily written for such a large economy that is more state-directed than others that we have seen, while some parts are very liberal and liberalized. So I think a lot of times the rules don't really capture, for instance, the way in which the Chinese state indirectly subsidizes exporters. And hence, China is very happy to pragmatically navigate the existing system of rules and does not even need to break existing rules, but it can just navigate the gray areas that are put in place and that were not written with a member such as China in mind.
So would you say that actually every WTO member could be described or regarded as a pragmatic rule taker, or are there also differences compared to, for example, the EU?
No, I think China's position really is distinct because of the kind of economy it has. And to be clear, all members are rule breakers once in a while. This is why there is dispute settlement and members launch cases against the US, China, Europe, all range of members. And then if they're found to be guilty, countermeasures will have to be taken. But I think China has been more pragmatic on some issues compared to other members from the global south. For instance, India, that has shown to be very inflexible and principled in some negotiation positions, where I think China has shown a greater willingness to navigate the space without, and this is, I think, is the red line that the WTO struggles with, without being willing to adjust its domestic economic system, which was not necessarily written with a market economy in mind.
And if we remain within the field of rule breaking, you distinguish between two types of contestation or rule breaking. So first there was claim contestation, how a rule applies in specific situation and that the rule breaker, so to say, only breaches the WTO in specific situations. And then frame contestation, challenging the validity of the rule entirely. What do you mean by this?
I mean, academics come up with all sorts of conceptual lenses that sound fancy, but the idea behind this is to simplify what we see and to make sense of it. So our starting point behind using this distinction that other researchers have come up with is to say maybe China's behavior in the WTO is not black or white. Maybe we need to have more nuanced perspective on what China is doing. And to have this distinction allows us to see that depending on the different sectors at stake, China may behave differently. So if we go to the steel sector, where state involvement in the economy is incredibly strong and where we see a lot of subsidized Chinese steel exports in markets elsewhere, we see a really fundamental contestation of WTO principles because this is not necessarily in line with the liberal underpinnings of WTO rules, even though China would, of course, contest it. And this is exactly why the contestation is going on. But in others, China may accept the rules and just contests how they are implemented. For instance, the existing compromise on agriculture and what subsidies are allowed to give China a bit more space. And I think this is an important distinction to allow us to see that in some sectors, same with the IT goods sectors, China is not challenging the liberal underpinnings of the WTO, but similar to other countries, it wants to get a bit more for itself in some ways.
Yeah, we focused now very much on China's role, but you also already mentioned other countries that are also acting alongside their interest. How does the EU engage within the existing WTO structures? Can we also identify some patterns of claim or frame contestations within the EU's behavior?
These conceptual lenses should in principle apply to all members of the World Trade Organization. The EU traditionally had less issues with the liberal underpinnings of the World Trade Organization being also organized more in market liberal terms internally. But even here, the EU has questioned whether there should be a discussion on one of the central liberal principles of the World Trade Organization, the so-called most favored nation principle. That's a bit more of a fundamental challenge to what the WTO is doing and how it's being organized compared to arguing that in agriculture subsidies, the allowances for subsidies should be distributed differently. Well, the US is very much in the business of fundamentally challenging WTO principles. So here it's not about can we apply and interpret the application of the rules differently, but the US has come to a stage where they're saying these rules don't work for us anymore. And I think what's behind it oftentimes is the perception that the rules that were written partly by the US after the Second World War, when the US was a major export nation, and the US hugely benefited from a system of open free trade, are nowadays benefiting China, one of the largest exporters, especially manufactured goods, more than the US. And from the US perception, there's unfair distortions going on, especially when some of these exports received subsidies or other kind of support that from the American perspective are perceived as dumping and that are not captured in the existing rules. This is why the US has said, if we can't reform the rules from inside, we're taking this outside of the WTO and we're just making our own laws. But I think what we've seen under Trump, ranging from the reciprocal tariffs to reciprocal trade agreements, is clearly not in line with WTO law. And it's an explicit position to say, well, we don't want to be bound by this anymore.
And is this a unique feature of the Trump administration, or does this also happen under Biden?
Yes and no. So the discontent with the way in which the dispute settlement system of the WTO was perceived by Americans to bias China, because in a lot of cases on trade remedies, it was actually China winning against the US. is bipartisan. So it was both supported by Democrats and Republicans, and some of the criticism of the way in which dispute settlement works in the WTO actually originated in the Obama administration. So I think even under a different administration, we would see fundamental concerns of the US with the dispute settlement system in the WTO. But the way in which we've seen the US implement these transactional reciprocal trade deals outside of the World Trade Organization is something very specific to the ideas of the second Trump presidency. And I'm pretty sure that if Kamala Harris had been elected president, we would not see the exact same turn in US trade policies outside of the World Trade Organization.
Yeah, that's super interesting to look at. But I think also we've seen this US-China trade rivalry or a securitization of trade actually since the mid-2010s. You said it started with Obama, but also Europe increasingly securitizes its trading relations. For example, I'm thinking of the Corbyn Border Adjustment Mechanism or anti-coercion instrument, investment screening. So we shift towards a securitization of the trade sector. And all of this inherently contradicts the WTO's objectives of creating a liberal, open trading environment. And we can actually say that we witness what you call a geoeconomic turn in international trade relations. So I would say let's take a look what this actually means, also maybe to EU-China relations.
Let me maybe also first say a word on this term geoeconomic, because there are many different definitions of it. But I think the essence is exactly what you described, that trade is either used to pursue security objectives or security objectives overrule free trade. We see states being more and more willing to regulate trade in ways that serve their foreign policy objectives. I do think we've seen this change also in the EU, but I'm also willing to put a footnote on it to say, yes, but it hasn't gone all the way through. So the EU remains a strong supporter of trade multilateralism, and the way in which the EU itself defends some of the unilateral trade instruments it has designed is to say they're actually compatible with WTO principles. When I look at debates amongst lawyers, I think there are question marks. Are they really, or isn't this just a performative way of framing it in terms of WTO compatibility? But we do see there is a willingness from the European side to try and frame what it does in terms of this is not against the WTO, while, for instance, from the US, which has undergone this turn to a much stronger extent, there is an open acknowledgement we don't want to be bound by WTO rules anymore. But of course, this is also affecting EU-China relations, as the EU has always seen China a friend, a competitor, and rival. And I think we're shifting more away from the friendly relationship towards rival, even though the three still coexist.
You now mentioned this triangle between the US, the EU, and China. Is the EU sort of trapped between the US-China trade rivalry?
I mean, a trap would assume the EU has no agency of itself. So I wouldn't go that far. But we do see that the EU is actively trying to increase its agency by decreasing dependency on both sides. So I think it would go both ways, trying to be less dependent on the US, especially in security terms, and less dependent on China in terms of reliance on critical sectors and trade, to kind of make sure Europe can retain and maintain agency and not get caught up too much in US-China rivalry.
You said that this liberal decline within the EU via, for example, instruments such as the anti-coercion instrument is more a question of framing it as liberal, although the actual consequences of it are less liberal. But how does this look in practice within WTO structures? For example, if we have investment screening mechanism that puts high hurdles on Chinese investments flowing into the EU, for example, how does China react to this? Is there an open discussions within the WTO between the EU and China about that?
There are many channels of communication between the EU and China, even outside of the WTO, but also inside of the WTO. So the way in which WTO negotiations work is that in between the ministerial conferences with the trade ministers, there are a number of trade negotiation committees that are organized around themes or sectors. For instance, the one on trade and environment is one where both China and the EU are active, where a lot of members have raised questions about unilateral EU legislation, such as CBAM or the EU deforestation regulation. But there's also interaction in the Committee on Trade and Development, because China has been leading this process for the investment facilitation for development agreement that the EU is also supportive of. And then, of course, outside of the formalized negotiation bodies, there's all sorts of diplomatic activities going on behind closed doors, but the Chinese diplomats are very professional, so I would be surprised if there isn't continuous interaction.
Is there an equal degree of interaction between China and the US?
I mean, the US has decided to remain a member of the World Trade Organization. I think they had also a review about it and put the budgetary contributions on hold, which they have now paid. So the idea behind it is to be able to engage in the discussions and negotiations. So there must be continuous interactions.
Yeah, sure, to not lose a seat at the negotiation table. So
yes.
Now we have predominantly talked about the US, China, and the EU. So very highly developed economies, trade powers, so to say. But I feel we're missing a part. The global South's interest gets marginalized, so to say. So to decenter our approach a bit, what do you think about the global South positions in the current WTO structures, but also crisis? What is their perspective?
Thanks a lot for the question. And I think you prefaced the question already saying, isn't this going to be more marginalization for the global South? And the general impetus I would agree with. But I must also say, especially when it comes to the World Trade Organization, there is not necessarily a homogeneous global South interest, because the so-called self-declared developing country members are so economically diverse that they do not agree on the kind of positions they want to push for. So China is one of the self-declared developing country members. It's also an active protagonist in the geoeconomic turn, which has, of course, very different interests compared to, let's say, a small trade-dependent country such as Singapore, right? So I think there is not one way in which global South countries all together are necessarily pushing. But what is clear, and this is something I also hear when interacting with diplomats from some selected global South countries, is in general, there is of course a fear that with the Trump 2.0 turn, we will see even less of the rule of law and even more of power-based rulemaking. We've seen this with the transactional approach that Trump is taking outside of the World Trade Organization. This is not going to be beneficial for a large majority of especially smaller developing country members. I mean, not having a functioning dispute settlement system is particularly costly if you are a smaller member, and this had allowed you in the past to challenge a bigger member. We see bilaterally, no country has really stood up to the US, maybe except for China to some extent. But this shows that there is really a danger for smaller countries to be caught up much more in power-based rulemaking. And I think also with the geoeconomic narratives becoming stronger, countries tend to be turning more inwards, and questions related to development, addressing existing inequalities and the disadvantaged position of marginalized economies within the World Trade Organization are becoming much less of a priority, but it's more difficult to ask for flexibilities in a context in which countries themselves feel more threatened, right? And feel they have to address these internal demands first.
Yeah, so maybe then concretely, how does the WTO benefit global South economies?
I think we've seen that countries that are more integrated into global trade have done better, right? So this has allowed countries to grow. It does remain very contested which model to follow, and some developing country representatives also argue existing WTO rules constrain the space they have, for instance, for industrial policies or other policies that would allow catching up before opening up the market. So there is a question about, is this system of laws been written with the interests of developing country members in mind? Primarily, that was not the first intention when this multilateral trading system was created, but there are recognizing that some some countries are in a more disadvantaged position, there are some rules in the World Trade Organization, so-called special and differential treatment for developing country members, that allow them more flexibilities. And this could be longer transition periods or some financial support. And in the past, it also used to be more exemptions. There's always this delicate dance for developing country members that know they benefit from being integrated more into the global trading system, but they also want to do value addition and not just export raw materials. So maybe having a bit more protection to allow your industries to advance before you export could be good. And there is this tension in what the rules actually allow you to do.
If we now move beyond WTO structures and maybe zoom also a bit more into your research, I know that you conducted interviews with Kenyan stakeholders about the EU trade agreement with Africa. How does Africa concretely perceive the EU or also China as a trade partner?
African countries are also not necessarily all adopting the same position. A country such as Kenya clearly sees opportunities in trade relations with the EU, with China, with the US. So this idea of trying to be friends with many trading nations is present for many countries that also are maybe less afraid of trade dependencies being securitized by others. So I think there's more of let's try and carve out opportunities. And is there a way in which these increasing competition can be used to possibly attract more trade flows or more investment to my country? But it's also complex because a lot of these countries find themselves constrained by the structural economic position they're in, including, in the case of Kenya, high debt dependencies. But they certainly don't have their hopes very high for the WTO to have a breakthrough on the Doha development agenda, but they prefer to have a rules-based open trading system with dispute settlement compared to a world in which power-based decision-making is the main principle. We do still have countries lined up to join the World Trade Organization. So this indicates there is a real perceived benefit from also smaller developing countries to join the World Trade Organization.
The smaller developing countries, do they have a strategy for a possible WTO reform?
Congo made a submission on WTO reform. So they do participate in these debates. The African group is also very active in the WTO to make its voice heard and to suggest the reforms they would want to see going forward. But we do know from how these negotiations work, it's one country, one vote. Of course, the major powers need to reach an agreement on how to take this forward. So some of these debates will require the consensus amongst the major members of the World Trade Organization, which unfortunately are very much in disagreement of how to take the World Trade Organization forward. In the case of the US, whether this is even the way to go forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we now diagnosed, so to say, the problem, the deadlock of the WTO and also beyond trade tensions that we face under geoeconomics. But now when we move on to proposing solutions or solving the actual deadlock, I'm not expecting us to now discuss finalized reform proposals that change the world. But maybe as a first question, what is important to consider when policymakers want to advance a reform for the WTO? What are the main features or characteristics that need to change?
Probably 2-3 main issues under consideration are first, how do members of the World Trade Organization reach a decision? How do they negotiate new deals? And this has traditionally been done under the consensus principle. And not just because there are 166 members, but I think predominantly because there are major members that are in disagreement of where to take the WTO. We've seen this can mean that one country can block outcomes for everybody else. And just at the last ministerial conference, there was, for instance, a standoff between the US and Brazil, where the US really did not want to agree to a shorter renewal of a moratorium on e-commerce. So the US blocked the agreement. But we've also seen the Investment Facilitation for Development agreement, which is an agreement that is not with all members of the World Trade Organization, but almost all. But it needs consensus to become part of WTO law. And India has blocked it as the only one member. So we do see members making use of this veto power. So a lot of diplomats are saying we should move not completely away from consensus making, but we need to facilitate those countries that do want to move ahead, to go ahead and make commitments. And Singapore made this proposal to have responsible consensus as a principle. but it's very difficult to implement moving forward. So this is one major area, the negotiations. Another major area is dispute settlement, the appeals body. So part of how you do the legal process when there is a complaint about a member on the WTO not really sticking to the rules is blocked since 2019, and there is a reform track on this, but frankly, I don't see any new appeals mechanism appearing because the US is so much against it and has made it clear. And the last track is a mix of different topics. This could be making the WTO fit for purpose and talking about trade and environment and newer issues, but also what the US and Europe are concerned about. Can we update rules on industrial policy, on subsidies, very much with having China in mind and how China's domestic economic system sometimes operates in this gray area of WTO rules. But again, this is also very difficult. These are different areas of reform that need to be considered. And I think the main difficulty is that you need to have consensus, and you have, in many cases, rules that exist already. Because oftentimes it's a lot easier to come together and reach a compromise for something new, because you know you have to give something and you get something. But here you have rules that were written. So if you have to give them up, then some members will lose something and they have to agree to doing that. So that's way more difficult as a starting point to reach a new compromise, so to say. So sometimes it's very difficult to reform existing rules and it's much easier to write new ones. But unfortunately, some of these reform areas need engagement with the written rules.
What do you mean by giving up rules?
I mean, for instance, the consensus rule. I don't think members really want to go away from a system of consensus decision making towards a system of majority rules making. But if you would go down that route, you would also give up your power to be the veto player if your country is disagreeing on something. So I think whenever you want to change the rules, somebody has to give in something. So it's a delicate dance, and there has to be a give and take, and that's tremendously difficult in the current political climate.
Let's now center this discussion back to China and the European Union. What are concrete reform proposals that come from both actors?
We have seen lively debate on WTO reform, and that was actually reinvigorated, I think, through the Trump shock on this world of trade. Just before the last ministerial conference earlier this year, both the EU and China made renewed submissions on reform. So they had made submissions before, but they've made new proposals again. And what they both emphasize, for instance, is the need to return to a functioning dispute settlement system. So there's very much agreement. But I think then there is also different emphasis. China emphasizes much more the development orientation of the World Trade Organization, but it has also a different interpretation of what fairness means in the context of WTO rules. And in the Chinese submission, they made it explicit that discussions, including on subsidies, and I quote this, must respect members' distinct economic systems and development stages. I think this makes clear that the distinct economic model that China is very successful with is not up for negotiation from the Chinese perspective. And this contrasts to what we see in the European reform proposal that on industrial policies wants to see stricter rules that would interfere somewhat with this distinct economic model. So I think there is some areas of agreement, but then also different emphasis. And I think the EU also probably more strongly emphasizes this idea of allowing the WTO to negotiate agreements that do not include all members, just to facilitate reaching consensus on something. This is something they call flexibility, which China is not necessarily against it, and they've been doing things like this before, but they use emphasizing that area more. And a lot of times these agreements, they are called plurilateral rather than multilateral, would be designed in a way that they are open. So if you're opening your market in these negotiations to the 150 members, you extend that to those that were not part of it, but they get no commitments. But even that currently has to be a consensus by all members to make this agreement part of WTO law. And if there is new flexible ways how to implement such agreements without consensus by all, that's something that from a European perspective, for the EU policymaker perspective, is something they would probably welcome.
Now we see that within trade policy or trade relations, EU-China cooperation is not always thriving. But when it comes to the WTO reform, do China and the EU proactively align their reform plans?
I mean, we don't see the proactive alignment. They have each submitted individual reform proposals. And I think there is ultimately on the overall package too much disagreement for them to have a joint submission. But there are substantive areas of joint interest in WTO reform. And I want to emphasize the dispute settlement reform. So this is something that both China and the EU strongly support, and where the EU with others has set up a stopgap measure, because now the appeals body is not working. So if you lose a case and you disagree, normally you can appeal, right? So this is not working anymore. And what these members have done, and the EU and China are part of it, they have set up, it's called Multi-Party Interims Appeals Mechanism, MPIA. So they have set this alternative appeals mechanism. So if you join the MPIA and you lose a case in the WTO, you can do your appeals process through the MPIA. The US, of course, has not joined. India also has not joined. And while interest is growing, I think including the EU, it's 33 members. Okay. So it's not the majority of WTO members, but this is something where the EU and China are actually on the same page. So this is an area where they could also think about, this is not meant to be a permanent solution. This is just meant to be a stopgap measure until the dispute settlement reform is successfully concluded. But with these reform efforts not going forward, this could be an area where China and the EU also get together and think about how can we improve the MPIA? Why are so many members not joining? How can we make it, for instance, more attractive to developing country members that are complaining in terms of the access they would have and some ways in which the dispute settlement mechanism from the WTO maybe makes access easier compared to the MPIA. So I think this is an area where they could work well together. And they have done so in the past.
So with the MPIA, we see a very concrete reform proposal to initiate a reform. Now reflecting upon effectiveness, feasibility, do you think EU-China cooperation is realistic when it already materialized in such a concrete institution, the MPIA, but going beyond, are there more hurdles that EU and China could encounter?
I mean, I think it goes back to the very beginning of our conversation, that it's not that in all areas of the economy there's a conflict, but in some sectors there are conflicting interests. But to be honest, I also think maybe the WTO can help in resolving them, right? Because there are also, for instance, WTO-compatible ways in which the EU can protect its market against Chinese exports, and the EU has used some of these ways in the past. So I think that's probably a better way than what we've seen coming from the US and just writing rules that are not even intended to be WTO-compatible, because it gives both sides also a space for dispute settlement, and both China and the EU are a member of the MPIA, so they also have an appeals process. So this can also help to resolve some of the conflicts that have emerged on the economic side. And there are also other areas where we see both potential for conflict and cooperation. So thinking about the trade and environment nexus, this is something where both have been active and have an interest, but sometimes they also have conflicting interests, but there are things to be learned. I think China is also pioneering circular economy models. So what we see in the WTO is that in this area, it's become less about lawmaking because that's so contested, and it has become more about informal exchanges, best practices, learning from each other, and there's also some merit in that.
Okay, so we almost close with a, I would say, rather optimistic outlook for the future. But is there one thing, a research finding or a remaining questions you would want our listeners to take away from this episode?
I think one thing we touched upon is the question of what does all of this mean also for smaller economies? And I think I would have a plea to have more of a holistic picture in how we approach some of these questions. And this goes beyond EU-China relations, but it also goes beyond global trade. So if we think about global challenges that need to be addressed, and they can include climate change and environmental degradation, all of this is interlinked. So if we just think about how the EU and China find some kind of compromise in resolving their trade differences, we have not thought about how do we resolve a better economic integration of disadvantaged countries into the economy so they can also transition quicker to the green economy, right? So I think all of these questions are interlinked, and I think it's important to have in mind to not also only think about how is this affecting major power relations, but also how are these changes that we observe affecting inequalities and the potential to address global challenges, which in the end requires to think about the positions of all countries that also need to come together to find solutions.
Okay, thank you very, very much for sharing your insights with us today. It has truly been a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and we wish you good luck with your upcoming research. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow the European Guanxi podcast for more, and see you next time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.